A valley so wide and cold it swallows secrets whole. A dusty main street, an entire town pretending not to watch. A stagecoach door swings open and every jaw in Harlow Creek goes tight. She steps down like she owns the ground under her feet. He's been waiting 47 minutes, arms crossed, hat low. A man who wrote a letter asking for plain and practical and is now looking at something that is neither. He opens his mouth and says the worst possible thing, right there, in front of everyone. She doesn't flinch, doesn't look away, just extends her hand and says 7 quiet words that stop the whole street cold. She should get back on that coach. She doesn't. And that decision made in 2 seconds on a dirt street in October is about to change everything. The stagecoach was 12 minutes late. Colt Briggs knew this because he'd been standing next to his horse for 47 minutes, and the coach was supposed to arrive at noon, and it was now 12 minutes past, and every single person in Harlow Creek was watching him stand there, and not one of them had the decency to pretend they weren't. He kept his arms crossed, hat pulled low, expression the kind that made most men in town find somewhere else to be. It didn't work today. Today, apparently, the entire population of Harlow Creek had decided that standing around in the October cold, watching Colt Briggs wait for a woman he'd never met, was the most important thing they had to do. Bess Carmody outside the dry goods store pretending to sweep a porch that didn't need sweeping. Deputy Wills tilted back in his chair outside the jail boots, up, grinning at nothing. Reverend Stokes, who had somehow found a reason to be near the post office despite the fact that Colt knew for certain the man only checked his mail on Thursdays. All of them. Every last one. And they all knew why he was standing there. Because 3 weeks ago, Grace Tully at the telegraph office had seen the outgoing correspondence and mentioned it to her cousin, who mentioned it to her husband, who said something at the barbershop. And from the barbershop, it moved through Harlow Creek the way all things move through Harlow Creek, like fire in dry grass, unstoppable and thorough. Colt Briggs had written to a matrimonial agency. At 41 years old, after 5 years of running the Briggs Ranch alone with nothing but cattle and cold silence, and the particular company of a man who has decided that expecting nothing from other people is the most reliable form of protection there is. That man had written a letter. His letter, according to Grace Tully's account of it, had been blunt to the point of being an insult. He knew what he'd written. Practical woman preferred, experience with farm work essential, plain features acceptable, must be willing to work without complaint. No expectations of sentiment. This is a working arrangement between 2 adults, and I will not pretend otherwise. He'd meant every word of it. He meant it because Ada Merritt had taught him something 5 years ago, standing at the front of the Harlow Creek Church in the dress she'd bought in Billings, surrounded by flowers she'd ordered from a catalog, accepting the hand of a railroad man from Denver, who had considerably more money and considerably more future than a cattle rancher with rocky pasture and a mortgage he was still paying down. She taught him that pretty women made calculations. They just didn't share the calculations with you until after you'd already built your life around the wrong answer. So he'd written what he meant, and now he was standing in the street, and the entire town was watching, and the stagecoach was 12 minutes late. The coach came around the bend at the far end of Main Street. Colt straightened up. His horse, a solid gray quarter horse named Flint, shifted once under his hand. He patted the animal's neck, said nothing, and waited. The driver climbed down, opened the door. 2 men got out first. Land surveyor type, new coat, never been on a horse. And old Pete Garfield, coming back from his daughter's place in Billings, walking slow, nodding at Colt, like he didn't notice anything unusual happening. And then the door swung wider, and the street went quiet. She stepped down from that coach the way some women enter a room they've already decided belongs to them. Not arrogance. Nothing as cheap or obvious as arrogance. Something older than that, more settled. The quiet confidence of a woman who has figured out exactly who she is and has stopped requiring anyone else's opinion on the matter. Tall, dark-haired, eyes the color of good coffee, sharp and still moving across the street in one slow measured sweep that took everything in and gave nothing back. She wore a traveling dress, dark blue, dust on the hem from the road. She carried a single leather bag that she set down herself before the driver could reach for it. Colt Briggs had not allowed himself to use the word breathtaking about any woman in 5 years. He thought it now before he could stop himself. And then the cold followed immediately behind it, flooding his chest like creek water in March. No, absolutely not. This is wrong. This is exactly what he'd specifically asked them not to do. He walked toward her. Bess Carmody stopped pretending to sweep. Deputy Wills's boots came off the railing. Even Reverend Stokes took 2 steps forward before catching himself. Colt stopped 3 feet in front of her. She turned and looked at him. He looked at her. She had the eyes of someone who had been measured and dismissed before and had decided at some point that it was more interesting to watch than to react. He spoke first. "Miss Calloway." "Mr. Briggs," she said. Her voice was even. Not warm, not cold, just steady the way a table is steady, built to hold weight without making a production of it. He looked at her for one long moment, long enough that the silence became its own kind of sentence. Then he said it, right there, in front of all of them. "There's been a mistake." His voice was flat. No cruelty in it, but no apology either. Just the plain fact of a man who says what he means. "A woman like you cannot be my wife." Not a breath moved through the crowd. Nora Calloway looked at him. She did not look at the crowd, did not look at her bag or her hands or the ground. She looked at Colt Briggs directly, and after exactly 2 seconds, she extended her right hand glove steady. "You're not what I expected either, Mr. Briggs," she said quietly. He didn't take her hand immediately. He stood there another moment, jaw working slightly the way a man's jaw works when he's chewing on something he hasn't decided whether to swallow. Then he shook it. Her grip was firm. His was firmer. They held exactly the same amount of time, released at exactly the same moment, like two people who had been trained in the same school of stubbornness and recognized it in each other without particularly wanting to. "My wagon's around the side of the livery," he said. "I assumed you didn't walk here," she replied. He turned and walked. She picked up her bag. She followed. Behind them, Harlow Creek exhaled. The ride out to the Briggs Ranch took 40 minutes on a road that was, in Colt's opinion, a generous use of the word road. Half-frozen mud. Wheel ruts deep enough to swallow a boot. He drove it the way he drove everything, fast and direct, and without commentary, which he considered to be a virtue. Nora sat beside him on the bench with her bag at her feet and her hands folded in her lap and watched the land open up around them. Montana in late October was not a landscape that asked whether you were ready for it. It simply was. Miles of frozen grass the color of old straw. Bare cottonwoods along the creek lines stripped down to their bones. Mountains to the north wearing their first serious snow pale and absolute against the gray sky. The kind of country that didn't make promises, that didn't apologize for itself, that simply existed enormous and honest and entirely indifferent to what you'd expected. She seemed to be looking at it the way you look at something you're trying to understand. Not afraid, not disappointed, taking it in. He didn't know what to do with that. Several miles passed in silence. Finally, she said, "How long have you ranched this land?" 12 years, he said without looking at her. "Alone for how long?" A pause. 5. "What happened 5 years ago?" The muscle in his jaw moved. "That's not your business." She turned to look at him. Not startled, not offended. The way someone turns when they've just noted something down. "I'm about to live on your property and share your name. Most things become my business eventually." He gave her the quick sideways look he gave things that had surprised him, but that he did not want to admit had surprised him. "Woman I was going to marry changed her mind," he said finally. "I'm sorry." "Don't be, it was a long time ago." People say that she said about things that weren't actually that long ago. He looked at the road. The wagon hit a rut. Both of them lurched, neither reached for the other. "What about you?" he said, and there was something slightly pointed in it, not cruel but testing. "Cincinnati, woman who can clearly take care of herself. What makes a woman write to a matrimonial agency and end up on a wagon in Montana?" She was quiet for a moment. "The same thing that makes a man write to one," she said, "running out of better options." He was quiet for a moment. Then unexpectedly the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something shorter and more reluctant than a smile. But something. They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and she watched the land, and he watched the road, and neither of them said what they were actually thinking, which was in both cases considerably more complicated than either of them was prepared to admit to a stranger. The house was worse than not much. Colt knew it. He'd said so in the wagon. The front step was cracked. The window on the west side had been boarded up and the patch was already starting to rot. The kitchen table had 3 good legs and one that had been replaced with a length of fence post. The stove worked, but the flue stuck. Nora walked through it without saying a word. She opened the back door, looked at the yard, closed it. She checked the stove, the water pump, the state of the larder, tested the latch on the cellar door, went upstairs, looked at both rooms, came back down. Colt stood in the middle of the kitchen with his arms crossed, watching her. "Well," he said, "she didn't say it looks like a prison. She didn't say it's worse than I imagined. She said the stovepipe needs cleaning before you use it, or you'll have a chimney fire before Christmas." She set her bag down. "The pump seal is going. You're losing pressure, and you'll lose it completely by February if it isn't replaced. The fence on the south pasture, the line I can see from the east window, needs restringing before the ground freezes. And whoever patched that west window used pine. They should have used cedar. It'll rot through by spring." A beat of silence. Colt looked at her. "You noticed all that," he said in 4 minutes. "I grew up on a working farm in Virginia," she said. "My father had 4 daughters and no sons. We all learned." She looked at him steadily. "Where's your chimney brush?" He stared at her. "Mr. Briggs," she said, patient, "I just told you the stovepipe needs cleaning. If it needs cleaning now, not tomorrow. Where is the brush?" Another long pause. Then he went to the back closet and came out with the brush. He handed it to her. She took it, rolled up her sleeves to the elbow, and got to work. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her for a long moment. She was entirely focused, not performing competence, not waiting to be acknowledged for it, just doing the work because the work needed doing. He went outside. He stood on the front step in the cold for a while, looking at the mountains. He had not had someone in this house in 5 years. He had forgotten entirely what it felt like to hear sounds in the kitchen that weren't his own. It made something in his chest feel strange. Not bad exactly, just strange. The feeling of a room that has been used the same way for a very long time and has suddenly been rearranged and is still right but is different, and you don't quite know how to move through it yet. He didn't like it. He went back inside. Supper that first night was a different kind of quiet than Colt was used to. His quiet had been empty. The quiet of a house containing one person and all the space around that person pressing in. This was occupied. The sound of a second plate set down on the table. A second chair. The silence of 2 people who don't know each other well enough to know what to say, but are at least pointed in the same direction. She'd made something out of what was in the larder. Salt pork, dried beans, cornbread she'd mixed and baked while he was checking the cattle. He hadn't asked her to. She'd just done it. He sat across from her and they ate. Halfway through the meal, she said, "The ranch is running at a loss." He looked up. "What?" "I found your ledger on the shelf in the front room." She set her fork down. "The numbers are off. You're carrying more cattle than your haystock can cover through a hard winter. And your water fee to the Harlow Creek Irrigation Cooperative went up 40% in the last 2 years. She looked at him. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm telling you what I see." "I know my own ranch," he said. "Then you know what I just said is true." He put his fork down. "Miss Calloway." "Nora." He looked at her. This woman he had tried to turn away this morning on a public street, who had cleaned his chimney and was now sitting across from him, telling him things about his own property that he had either missed or chosen not to look at. "Nora." He said it like it cost him something. "I've managed this ranch for 12 years. And I've been here 4 hours," she said. "I know, I'm not asking to run it." She paused. "I'm telling you what I see so we can solve it together. That's what partners do." The word partner landed between them and sat there. In the lamplight, she had a smudge of chimney soot on her left forearm that she hadn't bothered to wipe off. She looked in this moment considerably less like the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach, and considerably more like someone who had already decided this was her home. She was just waiting for him to catch up to that fact. "Where'd you study numbers?" he asked finally. "Kept the books from my father's farm from the time I was 16, she said. "And then for 2 years I worked in the accounting office of a dry goods merchant in Cincinnati before the business closed." She picked her fork back up. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Briggs. People do. Numbers just sit there and tell you the truth, whether you want it or not. He was quiet for a moment. Colt, he said. She looked up. If you're going to live here, he said, might as well use my name. Something crossed her face. Not a smile, a softening, small and brief and quickly recovered. The kind of expression that belongs to someone who has kept most of their feelings very close for a very long time and lets one out occasionally by accident. All right, she said. Colt. They finished supper without much more talking, and it was a different kind of quiet than before. He heard her before dawn. By the time he came downstairs, she was already dressed, already had the stove burning, already had her coat on. Where are you going? He said. South fence line, she said. I want to walk it before the ground freezes deeper. He stared at her. That's 2 miles of fence. Then I'd better start now, she said, and she went out the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee she'd already made and stood at the window, watching her cross the yard in the gray pre-dawn light, moving fast and purposeful, heading toward the south pasture. He tried to remember the last time anyone had walked that fence line for him. He couldn't. He set the cup down, picked up his hat, and went after her. They walked the south fence, mostly in silence, with Colt pointing out the sections he already knew were weak, and Nora spotting 3 more he had either missed or trained himself not to see. She walked and looked at everything. Constant, methodical, the efficiency of someone who has learned that information is never wasted. At the far end of the south pasture where the fence met the tree line along the creek, she stopped. That stake, she said. She pointed to a wooden post half buried in the frozen earth, maybe 20 feet from the main fence line. Is that a boundary marker? Should be, he said. Why? She crouched down and looked at it closely, reached out and touched the wood, pressed on it slightly with 2 fingers. This stake is new, she said. Her voice had gone very even, the evenness of someone who has found something and hasn't yet decided what it means. She stood and pointed to another spot in the ground nearby, an older, darker depression, the ghost of a previous post hole. Someone moved it, she said. It's 3 feet from where the original hole was. Colt went very still. Not dramatically, not with any visible expression changing, just still the way a man goes still when something clicks into place that he has been deliberately not thinking about for a while. Who owns the land on the other side of that creek? She asked. He said the name, flat, hard, the way you say a name when it carries 5 years of history in 2 syllables. Geddes, he said. Nora stood. She looked across the creek at the far bank, at the land beyond it. Then she looked back at the stake and at the ghost of the old hole and at the mathematical difference between where the boundary had been and where someone wanted it to be. 3 feet, across a full fence line, in the direction of the creek. 3 feet was water rights. 3 feet was leverage. 3 feet was the beginning of something that ended with a judge and a bill of sale and a family gone to Billings with nothing. She didn't say any of that. She just said, you have a survey map of your property back at the house. We need to look at it. She was already walking. Colt stood at the creek bank for one more moment, looking at the stake, at Geddes' land beyond the water, feeling something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the Montana morning. He had known somewhere for a long time. He had known that Harlan Geddes wanted his water rights. He had felt it in every too friendly conversation at the feed store, in every offer to buy him out that came in just slightly above fair market value, just generous enough to be insulting in a polite way. In every smile that lasted a fraction of a second too long before it reached the eyes. He had told himself it was nothing. Rancher's paranoia, a bad feeling with no real evidence. He looked at the stake. 3 feet, new wood, clean edges. He turned and followed Nora back up the hill. She'd been here one night and one morning. She'd already found what he'd been too close to see for years. That bothered him in ways he couldn't name yet, ways that were not comfortable and not simple, and that were sitting somewhere in his chest next to the word breathtaking that he was also trying not to think about. It also made him feel something he was even less prepared for, something that felt dangerously and inconveniently like relief. They spread the survey map across the kitchen table. Nora studied it without speaking, tracing the boundary lines with one finger, comparing them to notes she had begun keeping in a small leather journal she'd been carrying in her coat pocket all morning. He hadn't noticed her writing anything, but the notes were there. He watched her work. The original survey was filed in 1878, she said. That means there's a recorded copy at the county land office. She straightened up. Does your neighbor have a history of boundary disputes? He's never filed ones against me, Colt said. But 3 years ago, he made a similar claim against the Hartwell family, east of the creek. He looked at the map. Small boundary irregularity. Ended up in a full land hearing. The Hartwells lost half their water access and sold out to Geddes 8 months later. Nora was quiet. She looked at the map. She looked at her notes. She looked at the map again. Then she said, and no one connected those two things. Small town, Colt said. People see what they want to see. Geddes is the largest employer in the valley. Generous at church. Throws the best 4th of July in the county. He paused. People don't look hard at men who buy them lemonade. What about the judge? Colt looked at her steadily. Judge Aldred Holt has been county judge for 11 years, he said. His nephew works for Geddes. She absorbed it without visible reaction. Filed it. Moved on. Then we don't go to the judge, she said. Not yet. She closed the journal. First, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. All of it. And we need to know it before we do anything that can be seen. She looked up at him. You said we, he said. She looked back at him with the steady coffee-colored eyes and did not look away. Unless you'd prefer to handle it alone, she said. He looked back at her. This woman he had tried to turn away on a public street, who had cleaned his chimney and walked his fence and found a moved boundary stake, and was now standing at his kitchen table talking about county records and legal strategy like she'd been planning it alongside him for years. This woman whose name he had said at supper for the first time, the way you say a name when it costs you something. We, he said finally. She nodded once. She closed the survey map and folded it carefully, creasing it exactly along its original lines, and set it on the shelf. Then she turned back to the stove. There's still half a pot of coffee, she said, and your cattle aren't going to move themselves. He watched her for one more moment. Then he picked up his hat. Outside, the October cold pressed down on Harlow Creek, Montana territory, and the mountains to the north held their snow and said nothing and waited. The way mountains always waited, with the patience of things that had been there long before the men arguing over the land at their feet, and would be there long after. But inside the Briggs Ranch House kitchen, something was different from what it had been yesterday. Not warm, not soft, just different. The kind of different that if you'd been alone long enough, you stopped knowing how to name. That evening, Colt was coming back across the yard when he saw it. He almost missed it. A wagon pulling away from the edge of the Geddes property on the far side of the tree line south of the creek. Moving quietly, no lantern, the kind of movement that doesn't want to be noticed. He stopped. He stood very still and watched it go. And then he looked at the south fence line, at the place where the new stake was planted. He went back to the house. Nora was at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a sheet of paper beside it covered in her handwriting. Neat columns, notations in the margins. Already working on the ranch books. Nora, he said. She looked up at his face and knew something had happened. What happened? She said. He told her about the wagon, about the movement in the dark, about the way a man moves cargo when he doesn't want anyone to know what he's moving. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. Nora sat back in her chair, looked at the table for a moment, then looked up at him with the expression of a woman who has just received confirmation of something she already suspected. He knows I walked the fence this morning, she said. He has people in town, Colt said. She thought for a moment. Colt, she said, we need to find a lawyer, not from Harlow Creek. Someone with no connections here. Someone who can look at what we have and tell us what it means before we do anything else. I know someone, he said. In Billings, Gideon Falk. He handled my father's title transfer 15 years ago. Is he honest? Straighter than the fence line Geddes just moved. She nodded. Good, she said. Tomorrow go to the telegraph office, not Grace Tully's office. She looked at him. Is there another line? He thought. Western Union has a station at the rail depot. Different operator. Use that one, she said. Send the wire tonight if you can. We need him here before anyone in this town figures out what we're looking at." She turned back to the ledger. Colt stood in the doorway and watched her, and outside the Montana night pressed cold and absolute against the walls of the house. And somewhere across the creek in the dark, Harlan Geddes was doing whatever Harlan Geddes did when he had decided something was going to be his and was simply working out the timing. And inside the Briggs Ranch kitchen, a woman who had been in Montana for 36 hours was rewriting the cattle numbers in a ledger and planning 3 moves ahead. Colt had asked for plain and practical. He'd gotten something he didn't have a word for yet. He went to send the wire. Part 2. What gets found? Nora went to the county clerk's office alone. This was a decision she made at breakfast quickly and without drama, the way she made most decisions. Colt had mentioned going together and she had said no, not because she didn't want his company, but because 2 people walking into a clerk's office to look at land records attracted twice the attention. And attention right now was the one thing they could not afford. She wore her plainest dress, dark wool, the one that said, "I am here for practical reasons, and I am not interesting." She carried her leather journal and a pencil in the expression of a woman who has absolutely nothing to hide, which in her experience was more effective than actually having nothing to hide. The clerk was an older man with reading glasses, in the disposition of someone who had been guarding public records for 30 years and had strong feelings about people touching things. She smiled at him, not the warm smile, not the one that cost her something, the professional smile, the one she had used for 2 years in a Cincinnati accounting office when dealing with merchants who didn't want to hear what their numbers were saying. "Good morning," she said. "I'm looking at land transfer records from the last 10 years. For the county. I'd like to see what's available." The clerk looked at her over his glasses. "Those records are public," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." He took her to the records room. She was in there for 58 minutes. She read fast. Always had. Numbers especially. She could look at a column of figures and find the anomaly before most people found the column. It was a gift her father had noticed when she was 10 and developed when she was 16, and that a dry goods merchant in Cincinnati had paid her a modest salary to use for 2 years until the business went under and she had to figure out what came next. What came next had been more complicated than she'd expected. But that was not what she was thinking about. She was thinking about Merle Pratt, surveyor, licensed out of Helena, had signed 3 boundary dispute filings in this county in the last 4 years. 3 separate cases where a neighboring landowner had challenged a property line and brought in a surveyor from out of county to assess the discrepancy. 3 cases, all 3 resulting in findings that favored the challenging party, all 3 ending in land sales. All 3 sales going to Harlan Geddes. She wrote it all down: dates, case numbers, parcel descriptions, names of the families involved. Hartwell, 1881, lost their east pasture and creek access, sold out 8 months later. Dunley, 1882, lost 40 acres along the north boundary, sold out 4 months after the ruling. And there was a third one she hadn't known about. A small homestead, claim a widow named Jessup, 1880, lost her water rights, gone to relatives in Oregon within the year. Not 2, 3. The pattern was clear and it was old and nobody had looked at it because nobody had put the 3 pieces in the same room at the same time. Until now. She wrote at the bottom of the page, "Not coincidence. Pattern. Find Pratt's license and connections." Then she closed the journal, set the records back exactly as she'd found them, and went to thank the clerk. He was watching her with the expression of someone who was about to say something. "If you're looking to file anything," he said carefully, "you'd want to speak with Judge Holt." "I'm just doing research," she said, pleasantly. "Thank you for your help." She walked out into the October morning. She was halfway to the dry goods store when it started. She heard her name. Or rather, she heard herself being discussed, which was not the same thing, but was close enough to recognize. 2 women near the fabric bolts, voices carrying just far enough. The particular tone of people who want to be overheard without technically being overheard. She caught the words Cincinnati and dismissed, and couldn't find a husband, and had to go all the way to a matrimonial agency. She stopped walking. She didn't stop because it hurt. She stopped because she needed to make a decision. And the decision was this: walk past and pretend she hadn't heard it, which was the safe choice. Or walk toward it, which was the honest choice. And honesty in her experience was always more expensive in the short term and always cheaper in the long term. She walked toward it. The woman who had been speaking was about 45, well-dressed, standing near the fabric bolts with the bright, slightly feverish look of someone who had come to this exact location at this exact time, specifically to have this exact encounter. May Dunbar. She'd heard the name in the 3 days since she arrived. Heard it the way you hear a name when it keeps being associated with the same quality of story. Mrs. Dunbar, Nora said. Her voice was pleasant, completely flat. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. May Dunbar lifted her chin. I'm May Dunbar, she said. My husband is on the town council. Lovely, Nora said. I'm going to ask you something directly. Did you actually hear what you were just saying from someone with first-hand knowledge? Or is it a rumor that was passed to you and that you've chosen to repeat in a public place? May Dunbar blinked. She had not expected to be addressed head-on. People who spread rumors rarely did. I heard it from... She stopped. From whom, Nora said. Silence. I thought so, Nora said. She picked up the spool of wire she'd come in for, paid the man behind the counter, and walked out. 6 steps down the boardwalk, then footsteps behind her. Quick. Purposeful. Miss Calloway. She turned. Beat. The woman behind her was small, pale, brown-haired, maybe 48 years old. She had a careful, contained stillness about her. Not shyness, not quietness, something more deliberate than either. The economy of movement that comes from spending years trying not to draw attention to yourself. Nora recognized it. She recognized it because she had worn something like it herself. In Cincinnati. After Daniel Ashworth. After the company closed. The careful, compact life she had built for herself out of precisely the things she could control. Mrs. Geddes, Nora said quietly. Iris Geddes looked quickly in both directions along the street. Please don't say my name loudly, she said. Sheet. Her voice was low. Controlled in the way of someone who had practiced controlled for years. But underneath it, something older. Something that had been tamped down so long it had almost stopped trying to come up. Almost. I have about 3 minutes, Iris said, before I'm expected at the dry goods store. She looked at Nora with tired, careful eyes that had something burning underneath them that had not entirely gone out. What Victor told May Dunbar to say, she said, about Cincinnati. He had that story written up and distributed to 4 women in this town 2 days ago. She paused. A full account of your time there. Entirely fabricated. Designed to reach you here before you had time to make friends who would tell you it wasn't true. Nora kept her face neutral. Why are you telling me this, she said. Iris's jaw tightened. Because I watched him do this to the Hartwells, she said. And to the Dunnellys, and to a woman named Jessup who none of you probably even remember. Her voice stayed flat and controlled. Every time good people lost what was theirs. Every time I said nothing. I told myself I had no proof. I told myself it wouldn't matter. I told myself... She stopped. Her hands were absolutely still at her sides. I'm tired of saying nothing, she said. Nora looked at her for a long moment. What do you know, she said. More than I should, Iris said. More than is safe. Her eyes moved to the street again, then back. There's a box, in the room Victor uses as his study. He doesn't know I've read it. He has never known how much I read. Something flickered in her expression. Documents, letters, copies of survey filings going back 8 years, correspondence with Judge Holt, all of it. Her voice had dropped to barely audible. If someone had those documents, the entire scheme would be visible. Every piece of it, every family, every name, every payment. Nora said, how would someone get them? They wouldn't, Iris said. I would. She took 1 step back. Victor goes to the early service Sunday, then to breakfast at the Clover House with the council. He is gone exactly 2 hours. Her eyes met Nora's, and for just one moment the careful containment cracked the way ice cracks, not breaking, just showing the strain. Don't be late. She turned and walked away. Nora stood on the boardwalk and watched her go. Then she walked to the wagon and sat with the wire spool in her lap and her journal in her hand and looked at the main street of Harlow Creek for a while. 3 minutes. That was how long it had taken. 16 years of silence in 3 minutes. That evening, she told Colt all of it, word for word in the order it had happened, beginning with the clerk's office and ending with Iris Geddes on the boardwalk. He listened without interrupting. She had noticed that about him. He listened the way he did most things, without making a production of it, without performing attention, just actually paying it. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's never said anything before." "No." "In 16 years." "No." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "People need a reason," Nora said. "Or they need someone to say it to. Sometimes it's both." She looked at the table. She's been waiting for someone who would know what to do with it. The next morning, Colt did something Nora didn't know about until he told her that evening. He didn't tell her he was going. He didn't ask her to come. He didn't make it part of any plan. He just went. He went to find the Hartwell family's nearest neighbor, an older woman named Margaret Foss, who had lived on the adjacent property for 20 years and had watched what happened to the Hartwells in 1881 and had, according to people in town, not said much about it since. He found her at home. He told her who he was, what he'd found on his fence line, what Nora had found in the county records, and then he said something he had not said out loud before. "I knew something was wrong with the Hartwell situation when it happened," he said. "I saw it, and I didn't say anything because I told myself I didn't have proof, because I told myself Geddes was too well connected for it to matter." He paused, and because it was easier not to. Margaret Foss looked at him across her kitchen table for a long time. "You're the first person who said that to me," she said. He didn't know what to do with that, so he just sat with it. She didn't say much else that day, but when he got up to leave, she said, "The Dunnellys. Couple that lost the North Pasture the year before last. They're still in the county, east of town." She looked at him. "They might want to know someone's asking questions." He came home and told Nora. She didn't say she was surprised. She didn't say she was proud of him. She nodded once, in the way she nodded when something important had been done correctly, which was he was starting to understand as much as Nora Calloway was going to give you, and which was he was also starting to understand entirely enough. Jesse Crane came to the ranch on a Tuesday evening in the second week after Nora arrived, chasing the last of the light. A 15-year-old on a horse that was too big for him, riding fast in the way kids rode when they'd been told not to go somewhere and were going anyway. Colt went to meet him at the gate. The boy was breathing hard. His face had the look of someone carrying information they've been sitting on all day and can't sit on anymore. "Mr. Briggs," he said, "my father told me not to come here. I came anyway." "Catch your breath, Jesse," Colt said. The boy pulled in 2 breaths. "Mr. Geddes was at our store tonight," he said. "Him and my father and 2 other men. I was in the back doing inventory." He paused. "They didn't know I was listening." "What did you hear?" Jesse's voice was tight, not afraid, just honest, in the way that 15-year-olds were honest when they hadn't yet learned the particular adult skill of not saying what they'd actually seen. "Mr. Geddes said he's filing a boundary dispute against you before the end of the month," he said. "Said he already had the paperwork drawn. And he said," he hesitated, "he said your new wife was going to be a problem. Said he needed to make sure the town understood who she really was before she got any ideas." The cold that moved through Colt's chest had nothing to do with October. "He say anything else?" he said. Jesse looked at him. Young face, old eyes. "He said he'd been patient with you long enough," Jesse said, "and that this winter was the right time, because you'd be distracted." Pause. "Because of her." Colt stood very still. Then he said, "You did right coming here, Jesse. Go home now. Don't tell your father you came." The boy nodded, wheeled his horse, and rode back down the road. Colt turned toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see the lamp, the shadow of Nora moving inside, doing something at the table. Always something useful. Always the next task before you'd finish naming the last one. He thought about what Geddes had said. She's going to be a problem. He walked back to the house, opened the door, and stepped into the kitchen. Nora looked up from the ledger. She looked at his face and knew something had happened. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. She'd already heard the answer in his expression. She was asking for the specifics. He told her. All of it, word for word. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the table for a moment in the way she had of looking at things when she was processing them, not just the immediate problem, but the shape behind the problem, the logic underneath it. Then she looked up at him. Her expression was not fear. It was not panic. It was controlled, cold, precise anger. The kind that has been through enough to know that emotions are most useful when they're directed rather than expressed. He called me a problem, she said. That's what Jesse told me. She was quiet for one beat. Good, she said. Colt blinked. Good, yes. She looked at him steadily. In the lamplight, her eyes were very clear and very still. A man who considers you a problem is a man who takes you seriously, and a man who takes you seriously is a man you can fight. She stood up. Victor Geddes just told us exactly how afraid of us he is, she said. He wouldn't be moving this fast if he weren't afraid. Colt looked at this woman. 10 days on his ranch, in a county that had already sharpened its knives for her, facing a man who had broken better armed people than either of them. And she was talking about it like a problem in a ledger that had just become solvable now that the right variables were visible. He felt something shift in his chest, not comfortable, not soft, nothing like soft. Like standing at the edge of something enormous and finding out with some surprise that his legs were steadier than he'd thought. All right, he said. Then we fight. She nodded once. Then we fight. Sunday came with a sky the color of old iron and a wind off the northern range that had been somewhere colder before it got here. They rode to the Geddes property in the dark before sunrise. Colt stopped at the creek crossing, and she kept going without looking back, which was either confidence or stubbornness, and was probably both, which was something he had accepted as a baseline condition of life at the Briggs Ranch approximately a week ago. He waited. The cold pressed in. Flint shifted under him, patient. In the distance, the Geddes house was dark except for one lamp in the kitchen. He watched it. 15 minutes. Then she came back around the corner of the property at a pace that was not quite a run, but was not quite a walk either, and she had a wooden box under her arm that was heavy enough that she was carrying it two-handed, and her face had the expression it got when she was in the middle of something that required all of her attention. She got to him. He reached down. She passed him the box. He'd expected it to be lighter. It wasn't. They rode back without speaking until they were well clear of the Geddes property line, and even then she said very little until they were inside with the door closed and the box on the kitchen table. She opened it. Files, letters, papers, documents in several different hands, organized with methodical care that suggested someone had been adding to this collection for a long time. She was quiet for a moment looking at it. He was quiet beside her. Then she said very quietly, "She's had this for 8 years. He looked at the documents. She read all of it, Nora said. She knew everything. All of it. She picked up one of the letters carefully by the edge, and she kept it. Because she was afraid, Colt said. Because she was waiting. Nora set the letter back down. People who are only afraid destroy things. She kept it. She organized it. She added to it. She looked at him. She was waiting for someone who would know what to do with it. He looked at the box. At 16 years of a woman's courage taking the one form available to her. Gideon Falk arrived that Monday evening. Billings lawyer, 60 years old, worn briefcase, white hair, gray eyes that moved across a room with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has been in a lot of difficult rooms and learned that most of them looked worse than they were. He read for 2 hours without speaking. The stove ticked. Outside, the first serious storm of the season came down, sleet hitting the windows in waves. Nora sat across the table and waited. Colt sat beside her and did the same. Finally, Falk set down the last paper. This, he said, is one of the more complete cases of deliberate land fraud I have seen in 30 years of practice. His voice was the voice of a man who had made his peace with the fact that human beings were capable of most things and had organized his life around addressing the consequences. The Pratt connection alone establishes a pattern. The Holt correspondence establishes criminal conspiracy. He looked at them both. The question isn't whether you can win this case. The question is where you win it. Meaning what, Colt said. Meaning if you take this to Holt's courtroom, he suppresses the bribery correspondence before you finish your opening sentence. You spend 2 years appealing to a district court that Geddes may or may not have influence over. Falk looked at Nora. But if you file a complaint with the state land commissioner's office in Helena, Before the county hearing is held, the hearing is suspended pending state review. Geddes loses home court advantage. Holt loses jurisdiction. The whole case moves to a level where Geddes' local connections become considerably less useful. Nora leaned forward. How long does that filing take? If I send the telegraph tonight and follow it personally, I can be in Helena and file in person by Wednesday afternoon. Geddes' deadline is this week, Colt said. Falk picked up the Holt correspondence and looked at it again, holding it the way you hold something you're not sure you're going to see again. This letter alone is enough to trigger a mandatory state review, he said. The rest of this box turns it into a criminal investigation. He set it back carefully. How do you get to Helena safely if Geddes has people watching the roads? I go before dawn, Falk said simply. I'm an old lawyer from Billings. Nobody in this valley knows me by sight. I'm not the target. He closed the box lid. You two are the target, which means between now and Wednesday you stay on this ranch, you don't go to town, and you don't let anyone connected to Geddes know what's in this box. Colt looked at Nora. She nodded once. Go, she said to Falk, before dawn. After Falk had gone to the spare room, Colt and Nora sat at the kitchen table in the silence of two people who had just handed something very large off to someone else and were now dealing with the weight of what was left. The storm pressed against the walls. Nora had her journal open but wasn't writing in it. Colt had his coffee but wasn't drinking it. Outside, the wind moved through the places where the house wasn't perfectly sealed, and the lamp threw their shadows long against the wall, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then she said, I need to tell you something. He looked at her. She was looking at the table, not at him, which was unusual. Nora looked at things directly. The story Mae Dunbar was told, she said. About Cincinnati, about why I left. The real story. He waited. She was quiet for a moment, gathering something. He recognized the look. Someone who had kept a thing very close for very long and was deciding whether the person across from them was worth the cost of saying it out loud. The company I worked for failed, she said. The merchant made bad investments, and when the creditors came, the office closed. I wasn't dismissed. There was nothing to dismiss. The business simply ceased to exist. She paused. But the story that got attached to it was dismissal for cause, because that version was more useful to certain people. Useful how? He said. She looked at the table. There was a man, she said. His name was Daniel Ashworth. He was a merchant's son, charming, attentive, very good at seeming like the person you'd been hoping to find. She paused. When the company closed and I lost my income, he left. Not all at once. Slowly, the way cowards leave. And when he left the story behind him. Because it explained the leaving without requiring him to be the person who'd left. Colt said nothing. Just let her finish. So that's the truth, she said. That's what Mae Dunbar was told to say and why it worked. Because it was built around something real. There was a company. There was a dismissal in the gossip, if not in fact. There was a reason I left Cincinnati. She finally looked up at him. Not the reason, she said, but a reason. The kitchen was very still. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, he was a fool. She looked at him. Not surprised exactly. But something in her expression shifted the way things shift when you've been braced for something and the something turns out to be different from what you'd braced for. I wasn't asking you to, she began. I know you weren't, he said. That's not why I said it. Outside, the sleet drove against the windows in gusts. The lamp flame bent once and recovered. Nora looked at him for a moment longer. Then she closed her journal. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be long. She stood up and went to her room. Colt stayed at the table a while longer. He thought about Daniel Ashworth, who had apparently been the kind of man who left and then rewrote the story so he didn't have to be the one who'd left. He thought about Ada Merritt, who had done something similar in a different way in a different town. He thought about the kind of people who did that. And then he thought about the woman who had just told him the truth about a thing she had no obligation to tell him the truth about. In a kitchen in Montana, with a storm outside and a box of evidence on the table, and an old lawyer asleep in the spare room. Because he had been honest with her, and so she had been honest with him. He blew out the lamp and went to bed, but not before checking the door and checking the window. And standing for a moment in the dark of the front room, listening to the storm and the house around it solid and plain, and not much to look at from the outside, but standing, holding against it, the way it had been built to do. Part 3, what gets named. Gideon Falk left at 4 in the morning. Nora heard him go. She'd been awake anyway, lying in the dark with her mind doing the thing minds do when something very large is in motion, and there is temporarily nothing to do about it except wait. She listened to the sound of his horse leaving the yard, getting quieter, gone. And then the ranch was silent except for the wind and the sounds of a house settling in the cold. She was at the stove before first light. Coffee first, then the cattle figures. She'd reworked the hay rotation numbers twice already and had a third version that she thought would hold through a hard winter if they moved the north herd to the east pasture before the ground locked. She wanted to go over it with Colt before he went out to check the lines. He came downstairs at 5:15 and stopped in the kitchen doorway. "You sleep at all," he said. "Some," she said, which was true. Some was technically accurate. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her and looked at the papers without being asked to look at them. She appreciated that. He understood that work was what they had right now. Work was the only thing that was actually useful. "Hay rotation," she said. "Move the north herd east before the freeze. You'll lose the north pasture for the season, but you'll save 30 head you'd otherwise lose by January." He looked at the numbers. "You're right," he said. "Not let me think about it. Not that's not how I've done it. Just you're right." She held that quietly in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. They did not talk about Falk. They did not talk about the box which she had locked in the chest under Colt's bed with the key around her neck. They did not talk about what was happening in Helena because there was nothing to say about it yet that would change anything. They worked. Tuesday was the longest day. Colt checked the cattle twice, split enough wood to last through February, fixed 3 fence posts on the west line that had nothing wrong with them except that fixing them gave him something to do with his hands. Nora updated the ledger, restocked the larder from the cellar, mended 2 sections of harness, and reorganized the supply shelves in the barn in a way that she thought was more efficient, and that Colt looked at when he came in and did not comment on, which she took as agreement. They ate supper. They did not talk about Wednesday. After the dishes, she went outside. Not for any particular reason, just to stand in the cold and breathe and let the night be larger than the inside of her own head for a few minutes. The sky was clear, stars everywhere, the way stars existed out here, in a way they never existed in Cincinnati, too many and too bright, the kind of sky that made you feel very small and also very specifically located, like you were standing in one exact spot in something enormous, and at least you knew where that spot was. She heard the door. Colt came out and stood beside her. Not close, just beside, the way he'd been beside her since she got here, present, but not pressing, available, but not insisting, which was a quality she had not encountered often in men and had not expected to find in one who had introduced himself by telling her she couldn't be his wife. They stood in the dark for a while. She said it before she'd decided she was going to say it. "I'm doing it again," she said. He didn't say doing what he waited, which was his way of asking. In Cincinnati, she looked at the stars. After Daniel, after the company, I built my life down to exactly the size of what I could control. Very small, very careful. Nothing in it that could cost me anything I couldn't afford to lose. She paused. And then I got on a stagecoach and came to Montana and walked into a house I'd never seen, and I've been... She stopped. She was going to say I've been careful. But that wasn't true anymore, and she knew it wasn't true anymore, and that was the problem. "I've been trusting you," she said, "and I'm not entirely sure when that happened or what to do about it." The cold pressed in around them. Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know." Just that. 2 words. No reassurance attached. No promise about what it meant or what would follow from it. "I know." Which was, she realized, exactly the right thing to say. Not "you can trust me." Not "I won't hurt you." Not any of the things men said when they wanted you to feel better. Just "I see what you're doing, and I'm not going to make it into something you have to manage." She breathed out once, slowly. "Okay," she said. They stood outside for a while longer. Then they went in. Wednesday arrived gray and quiet and ordinary looking the way days that are about to matter almost always arrived. At 8 in the morning, a wire came. Not to Grace Tully's office. To the Western Union station at the rail depot. Nora had been up since 5. She drove into town alone in the gray light, and the operator was a young man named Collins, who had no visible connection to anything or anyone in Harlow Creek's complicated social geography, and who handed her the wire with the expression of someone being paid to not have opinions. She unfolded it, read it again. Filed, state review ordered, Holt suspended from case. Independent hearing officer appointed by state commissioner. Hearing reset Friday, 10 a.m. County Courthouse. Come ready, GF. She folded the wire, put it in her coat pocket, walked out of the depot into the gray October morning, stood next to the wagon for a moment. She exhaled once hard, one single moment of hands not quite steady, one moment of breathing, just one. Then she got in the wagon and drove back to the ranch. She told Colt. He read the wire, set it down, looked at the table for a moment with the expression of a man who has been holding something very tightly for a long time and has just found out he can put it down. It's moving, she said. It's moving, he said. Holt is out. Holt is out. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then Geddes came. Wednesday afternoon, 3:15. A horse and rider coming up the ranch road at a pace that was not urgent, but was not casual either. The pace of a man arriving to deliver information he has already decided on. Harlan Geddes, alone, which told her something. He had come without his lawyer and without his men, which meant this was not a legal visit and not a physical threat. It was something else, the kind of visit designed to look like a reasonable conversation while communicating something entirely different. Colt went to the door. She stayed at the table. Geddes got down from his horse. 55 years old, silver-haired, well-dressed in the way that said, money without requiring an audience. He moved through spaces the way water moved downhill, finding the path of least resistance, ending up exactly where he intended. He looked at Colt. I heard you've been asking questions, he said. His voice was warm, easy, the voice of a man who had spent decades making other men comfortable before he needed something from them. I ask questions about my own land, Colt said. Of course. The smile didn't waver. I want you to understand something, Colt. Whatever you think you found, it won't change things. Not in this county, not in front of Judge Holt. Judge Holt isn't on the case, Colt said. A pause, not long, half a second. But Nora, watching from the table, saw it. The very small recalibration that happened behind Geddes' eyes before the smile recovered. I'd heard some rumor about a filing, Geddes said. Lighter now, careful. I wouldn't put much stock in it. These things get complicated. Is that what you came to tell me? I came to make a final offer, Geddes said. Out of respect for what your family built here. Sell me the water rights. Fair price. You keep the land, the cattle, everything else. This whole thing goes away. Colt looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. No explanation, no negotiation. Just the word itself, flat and final. Geddes looked at him. The pleasant manner was still there, but it was thinner now, like paint on old wood, and you could see the grain coming through. You're protecting something, Geddes said. I respect that, but ask yourself whether what you're protecting is worth the cost of what's coming. I ask myself that every day, Colt said. The answer hasn't changed. He closed the door. Nora heard the horse leaving. She looked up from the table. Colt came back to the kitchen and sat down. He knows the filing happened, she said. He knows something happened. He doesn't know what's in the box. Not yet. She looked at her journal, thought for a moment. He's going to move fast now, she said. Before Friday. What can he do? He's going to try to take away our credibility before we can present the evidence, she said. Same thing he did with me and May Dunbar. If he can make the hearing officer question our motives before we've said a single word, he doesn't need to argue the evidence. She stood up. We need people who can speak to the pattern, she said. Not just us. We need the Hartwell's neighbors. We need anyone who saw what happened to those families and kept quiet. Colt thought. Margaret Foss, he said. Yes. And the Dunnellys are still in the county. Can you get to them tonight? "I'll go now," he said. He did. He came back 2 hours later with Margaret Foss's agreement to appear and a sworn statement from both Donnellys that Gideon Falk had said he could have properly notarized by morning. And something else. Margaret had a neighbor, he said. A woman named Jessup, widow, lost her water rights in 1880, moved to Oregon. He looked at Nora. But her daughter is still here, married to a man on the East Road. Margaret thinks she might talk. Nora nodded. Get her. He got her. The night before the hearing was the night Nora sat on the porch. Not planning, not working, just sitting. It was the first time in 2 weeks that she had done something that was not directly useful, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. Her hands kept looking for something to hold, and there was nothing, and she had to keep telling them to just rest. Colt came out. He sat beside her. Not beside her the way strangers sat beside each other. The other way. The way you sat beside someone when you'd been through something together, and the something had changed the distance between you, whether you'd intended it to or not. She looked at the dark and thought about tomorrow. And then she stopped thinking about tomorrow because there was nothing left to do about it tonight, and started thinking about something she'd been not thinking about for 2 weeks. She said it. Back in Cincinnati before I left, I made myself a rule. She looked at her hands. Small life, controllable life, nothing in it that I couldn't manage alone if I had to. She paused. I was good at it. I'd gotten very good at it. Colt said nothing, just listened. I thought that was the right way, she said. I thought making yourself smaller was how you stayed safe. She was quiet for a moment. And then I read your letter. He looked at her. Your letter was honest, she said. Not kind, not particularly flattering. Honest. She almost smiled. You listed your requirements like a man ordering supplies, which was rude. The not quite smile held. But it was honest, and I hadn't had honest in a while. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I told myself I wanted plain and practical. I know, she said. I told myself I didn't want anything that would... He stopped. She waited. I told myself I wasn't going to do this again, he said finally. The thing where you let someone in and they become... He stopped again. He was not a man who finished sentences like this easily. She could see him working against his own habit of silence. I told myself a working arrangement was what I needed. Nothing more than that. And, she said, he looked at her. And I was wrong about that before you stepped off the stagecoach, he said, which I find extremely inconvenient. She looked at him. He was looking back with the steady gray eyes and the expression of a man who has decided something and is not sure what to do with the decision, but is done pretending he hasn't made it. How long, she said. First morning, he said. You walked the fence line before I was awake. Something in her chest did the thing it had been carefully not doing for 2 weeks. You're going to be very difficult to be married to, she said. I know, he said. So are you. She looked at the dark. He looked at it too. They sat there for a while, and then they went inside because it was cold and because tomorrow was going to be what it was going to be, and they had done everything they could do. The Harlow Creek Courthouse was fuller on Friday morning than it had been for any proceeding in 11 years. People standing along the walls, sitting on windowsills, crowded into the doorway. The Briggs case had stopped being a boundary dispute and had become something the whole valley felt implicated in, whether they fully understood why or not. The hearing officer was a man named Graves, 50, compact, sent by the state land commissioner with the expression of a man who had been dispatched to do a specific job and had no particular patience for anything that wasn't that job. Victor Gaddis sat at one table with 2 lawyers from Helena, dressed carefully, silver hair in perfect order, the posture of a man entirely certain of his position. Colt and Nora sat at the other table with Gideon Falk between them. She had dressed plainly. Dark dress. Hair up. Nothing about her appearance that could be used as a distraction from what she was about to say. She had planned it that way. Gettys's lead lawyer opened, smooth, well-prepared. The boundary claim the Pratt surveys the assertion that the Briggs Ranch had been improperly exercising water rights for years. It sounded entirely reasonable if you didn't know what she knew. She knew what she knew. Graves listened without expression. Then Falk rose. I'd like to enter into evidence a series of documents demonstrating a pattern of fraudulent survey filings coordinated between Victor Geddes and licensed surveyor Merle Pratt, dating back 9 years, covering 4 separate property disputes in this county. He set the stack on the table. Additionally, I am entering correspondence between Mr. Geddes and former County Judge Aldred Holt, confirming payment received in exchange for favorable rulings. The first payment dated October 1880. The most recent dated July 1883. The room did not erupt. It was a courthouse. People were trying to behave like adults. But the sound that moved through it was the communal intake of breath that happens when a community realizes simultaneously that the thing it had suspected but never said out loud has turned out to be true. Geddes' lawyer was on his feet, objecting fluently. Falk responded, equally fluently. Graves listened to both of them with the expression of a man reading a document he has already decided what to do about, but is required by procedure to read completely. Then he said, I'll also note that statements have been provided by 3 families, Hartwell Dunnelly and the estate of the late Mrs. Jessup, all of whom suffered land losses following similar boundary challenges by Mr. Geddes over the past 4 years. Geddes' lawyer said something into his client's ear. Geddes shook his head. Once, sharp. Graves looked at Nora. Mrs. Briggs, he said, you were present when the fraudulent boundary marker was first identified. Please describe what you found. She stood. She described it. Precisely, in order. The date, the time, the exact location, the measurements. The difference between the new stake and the original post hole. The distance toward the creek. What that distance represented in terms of water access. She spoke without embellishment. She spoke the way she'd kept books. Accurately, specifically. Nothing wasted. When she sat down, Graves made a note. Then Geddes stood up. Wrong move. She could see Falk recognize it at the same moment she did. The lawyer reached for his client's arm. Geddes shook him off. This woman, Geddes said, and his voice had gone harder than she had ever heard it, the pleasant manner stripped away to something more truthful underneath, is a fraud from Cincinnati. She came here with nothing. She attached herself to a lonely man and manipulated him into this. She sat very still. She did not move. She looked at Victor Geddes with the level measuring look she'd been giving difficult men since she was 20 years old. The look that said, I am hearing every word you are saying, and you should know that. Then Colt stood up, slowly. The way he did things when he had decided. He stood up and turned to face the room. All of it. Every person who had watched and whispered and let Mae Dunbar's stories move through the valley like groundwater. And when he spoke, his voice was level and final and left no room for anything. This woman, he said, walked onto my ranch and in 48 hours found evidence of fraud that I had been too close to see for years. She walked my fence line before I was out of bed. She read account books I had been avoiding for 2 seasons. She found a pattern in county records that nobody else had looked for. He paused. She secured evidence that protects this ranch and 3 other families in this valley who had already lost what was theirs and who had stopped believing anyone would ever say so out loud. He was not loud. He did not need to be loud. She has worked harder for this land and for this community in 3 weeks than a lot of people in this room have in 3 years, he said. And I will not sit here while a man who has been stealing from his neighbors for a decade points at her and says the word fraud. He sat down. The silence held for 3 seconds. From along the east wall of the courtroom, a woman's voice said clearly and firmly, "That's right. Margaret Foss." And the sound in the room shifted, not dramatically, not the way things shifted in stories, the way they shifted in real life, in the small, irreversible way that happens when enough people stop pretending they don't know what they know. Geddes' lead lawyer touched his client's arm. This time Geddes let him. He sat down. Graves read the Holt correspondence. He read it twice, set it down. Mr. Geddes, he said, the boundary dispute claim filed against the Briggs Ranch is hereby suspended, pending full state investigation into the survey filings and the judicial conduct referenced in this correspondence. All parties are to make themselves available to the state commissioner's office for individual testimony within 2 weeks. He gathered the documents. Mr. Briggs, your water rights and property boundaries remain in full legal standing pending final determination. He stood. This proceeding is adjourned. Done. Not with a speech, not with a dramatic reversal, with a man putting papers in a pile and standing up and leaving. Falk leaned over and said quietly, "The criminal investigation into Holt will take 3 to 6 months. Geddes' lawyers will delay, but the land claim is dead. He won't recover from this in this county." "What about the other families?" Nora said. "Civil complaints can be filed through my office. The Hartwells and Dunnellys both have claims strong enough to recover partial compensation." He closed his briefcase. "It'll be slow, but it'll happen." Nora nodded. She looked at the box on the table. The documents Iris Geddes had spent 8 years adding to. The evidence she had kept organized ready, waiting for the right moment. "She took the real risk," Nora said. "Not us." "She did," Falk agreed. "I hope she knows it mattered." He tipped his hat and went to find his horse. Geddes walked out without looking back. Just walked out, surrounded by lawyers, stiff and deliberate, and the room that had been his by money, by social standing, by 20 years of careful cultivation, watched him go and did not follow. They walked out of the courthouse into the gray October afternoon. The air was cold, ordinary. The main street of Harlow Creek lay in front of them, quiet and familiar, exactly the same as it had always been, except that everything in it had shifted by some small and permanent degree. Across the street, Mae Dunbar saw them. She held Nora's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she dipped her chin. Not an apology, not warmth, an acknowledgement. The nod of a woman who has accepted that she misjudged something and cannot entirely walk it back, but can at least stop pretending it didn't happen. Nora would take it. They drove back to the ranch in the silence of people who have been through something together and come out the other side and know they are on the other side. About halfway home, Colt said, "You're not going to say it." She glanced at him. "Say what?" "That you told me so." She looked at the road. "I never thought you were wrong about your land," she said. "I just thought you needed someone to help you see it clearly." "That's generous." "I'm a generous woman," she said. And this time the smile came. Not the professional smile, not the small, carefully managed softening. The real one. The warm, unhurried one that belonged to early mornings in the kitchen and honest conversations and the ease of being known by someone and not made smaller by it. He watched it happen on her face and felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't realized had still been clenched. He didn't say anything, but he guided the wagon slightly closer to her side of the seat, and she didn't move away. The letter from Iris came in the second week of November, 3 pages in neat, careful handwriting. Iris wrote about Bozeman, about her sister's house, about the luxury of sleeping through the night without listening for footsteps, about waking on the third morning and realizing she had spent the first 2 hours of consciousness without thinking once about what she was allowed to say. And then she wrote, "I have spent 16 years being afraid of a man who understood very well that a woman with nowhere to go and no one to believe her can be controlled. You walked into that valley with nowhere to go and no one who knew you, and you refused to be controlled anyway. I want to grow up knowing that's possible. I watched you do it. It was the most useful thing I have ever seen. Thank you for knowing what to do with what I gave you. Thank you for doing it." Nora read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Colt was outside. She read it once. She set it flat on the table and pressed both hands on top of it and sat there for a moment with her eyes closed. When Colt came in, she was at the stove with her back to him, and her shoulders were doing something she didn't have language for. Not shaking, carrying, the way you carry something when it has finally arrived after a long time in transit. He came in, took off his hat, said nothing, poured himself coffee and sat at the table and waited. After a moment, she turned around. Her eyes were dry. Her face was composed, but there was something at the edges of it he recognized. The look of a person who has been given something they didn't know they needed until they had it. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it, the whole way through. When he finished, he set it down and folded his hands over it and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at her and his voice came out lower than usual. "She's right," he said. "Every word of it." Nora put her hands around her coffee cup. "I wasn't brave," she said. "I was angry. There's a difference." She paused. I kept thinking this man is counting on everyone being too afraid to look directly at him. Her jaw tightened with the memory of it. I cannot stand a man who counts on other people's fear. I know, he said. And then after a moment, I was counting on it too, in a different way. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I spent 5 years counting on people not looking at me closely enough to see I was barely holding together. He didn't look away from her when he said it. She didn't look away from him. You looked directly at me, he said, right there on the street when I said that thing I can't take back. You looked at me and you didn't flinch. She shook her head slightly. You looked ashamed, she said. Not embarrassed, ashamed, like a man who knows he fell short of who he actually is. She paused. Good men feel that distance between who they are and who they acted like. It costs them something. She held his gaze. That's when I knew you were worth staying for. He stood up from the table. She didn't move. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been afraid to look at directly and has finally stopped being afraid. He reached out and put one hand against the side of her face. She reached up and covered it with hers. That was all. It was enough. The envelope from the State Land Commissioner's office arrived in January. Final ruling. Briggs Ranch. Full and uncontested water rights and property boundaries as surveyed and recorded in the original 1878 filing. The boundary dispute claim filed by Getty's Land Holdings permanently dismissed. Colt read it at the kitchen table. He handed it to Nora. She read it, set it down. It's done, she said. It's done, he said. She nodded once the way she nodded when something had been accomplished that needed to be accomplished, and it was time to move to the next thing. Then she said, the east pasture needs another water trough before spring. He laughed, a real laugh. The kind that came from somewhere loose and unguarded, the kind a man made when he had forgotten he was capable of it. And then it happened, and the surprise of it was its own particular joy. She looked at him with the real warm smile, the one that belonged to him and to this kitchen and to no audience anywhere. I'll build it next week, he said. We'll build it, she said. And that was the truth of how it ended. Not with a single grand moment, not with a speech, with a woman who said, we like it was the most natural word in the language, and a man who heard it and completely believed it. Outside, the first snow of the new year was beginning to fall across the Montana Valley. Light at first, then steady and committed, the kind that came in January and meant what it said. It settled on the fence line she had walked and the boundary stake that had been returned to its proper place by order of the State Land Commissioner. It settled on the south pasture and the north herd she had moved before the freeze, and the 40 cattle that were going to make it through winter because of a decision made at a kitchen table by someone who read ledgers and knew what the numbers were saying. It settled on the ridge above the ranch and the creek and the long, honest stretch of Briggs land that was exactly as large as it had always been, belonging to the people whose names were on it. Inside the ranch house kitchen, Colt Briggs and Nora Calloway. Briggs sat at the table with the ledger between them and their hands joined over the corner of it, and the silence in that house was not empty. It was the silence of two people who had fought for something together and earned something together, and were now for one honest winter evening simply at rest inside it. He had written a letter asking for a woman he could not love so that he would never have to feel the particular terror of losing someone again. He had received instead a woman who had walked into his broken life with her sleeves already rolled up, who fixed what was broken and fought what needed fighting, and refused at every turn to be smaller than she was. He had tried to send her away on a public street in front of everyone who knew his name. She had shaken his hand instead. And in doing so, Nora Calloway had not simply saved his ranch or his water rights or his standing in a valley that had underestimated them both. She had saved the thing that had actually been at risk from the beginning, the man himself. That was all of it. And it was enough. More than enough. For one lifetime, for one winter, for one honest house standing warm and solid against the Montana cold, holding two people who had found in each other exactly what they had stopped believing still existed. Not a soft fantasy, not a simple arrangement, the real thing, chosen, fought for, and kept.